You're listening to Why We Do What We Do.
Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your striving toward death host, Abraham.
And I'm your wielding a bow and arrow of love host, Shane.
We are a psychology podcast. We talk about what people do and why they do the things that they do, and that's why we're called Why We Do What We Do. Mm-hmm. And we unpack, I think the well-known and more than anything, the maybe less well-known aspects of psychology and human behavior, and we try and do it with that nice scientific sheen.
Yes, and then sometimes we find a subject in psychology that's a little bit ridiculous and a little bit absurd, so we like to debunk that. So today we are going to spend a little bit of time unpacking a thing that probably doesn't deserve the airtime it's going to get today.
That's fair. Yeah. I would be interested to do an analysis of how much, what percent of our episodes or how much time we spend doing debunking type topics, because it is a decent chunk.
Yes,
I would say.
Yes. This one in particular, though, I think fits. Sometimes we have episodes that are like interviews and debunking, or history and this or that, or we kind of have some that are like mix and match. This one is so strictly debunking. It couldn't be anything else. It's kind of like how some Pokemon are dual type. There's water, rock, and stuff like that. This one is strictly water, right? That's the tag that we would get here. No other hashtags.
Fair enough. Moving on from that, before we get into our top, we've alluded to it. We've whet the palate, as you might say. We've tried to generate appetite for our discussion.
Sure.
More euphemisms about things that might have you intrigued. So if you are listening to us on the date that this releases, great job. Turns out we like to talk about the holidays that we celebrate on the dates that these episodes release. The thing that we do.
We do it often. Sometimes, because time is a construct, we mess up things. And so this is one of those moments where maybe there was some kind of flux in time. Maybe, I don't know, a sunspot hit the earth and threw off our clocks. I don't know. Something happened, but we made a mistake.
Yes. One thing that definitely happened is I skipped a week in January in my release scheduling. And so anyway, what you heard last week in our episode on the matching law were the actual dates for this week. So if you want to go back and check those out, feel free. I guess we can summarize them really quick. It was National Hot Chocolate Day, Eat Brussels Sprouts Day, Inspire Your Heart with Art Day. Remember the others?
It was Gorilla Suit Day. There were quite a few. I can't remember off the top of my head. So there were quite a few, and we celebrated them all, and we celebrated them very hard. So I think that's probably why we don't remember them as much.
Partied so hard on Brandy Alexander Day and National Backward Day and Hell is Freezing Over Day.
Yeah.
Anyway, so those are the things. That's today, and so sorry that we got our calendars off, but we're now back on track, I think.
Yeah, we should be good. So you should be able to return to enjoying your holidays on an actual agreed upon, socially valid schedule.
We know that you are all following these really closely, and we're upset about the fact that we got those dates wrong. So
please don't update our Wikipedia to say that we messed this up and that we're a bad podcast.
Do we have a Wikipedia?
Just for posterity's sake, just in case somebody finds us later, and we're famous by then.
Yeah. Well, let's get to the actual episode then.
Yes.
We are actually not a podcast about the dates. We just are hey, it's kind of a fun thing to talk about. But we're actually here to, as you said earlier, unpack a very silly thing that has been done in psychology. And before we get into that, if you would like to support the show, probably not based exclusively on our celebration of holidays, but maybe that's your thing, you can leave us a rating and review. You can subscribe, join us on Patreon, pick up some merch, tell a friend about us, do other things that would support us that you can think of. Follow us on Spotify or just set all your different apps to automatically download every episode of ours. You can figure it out. It's all good. And I'll talk more about the ways that you can support us at the end of this discussion. But let's go ahead and get into this today, because we get to talk about some mythology stuff, which is always fun. I mean, for a little bit anyway.
Yeah, so I'm really excited about this. And so we are talking today about the death drive, or the death instinct, that was maybe coined by Freud, maybe not. We'll unpack that. So a couple questions we're going to ask today are going to be, what is the death drive or the death instinct? Is there any clinical use in understanding what the death drive is? And really, those are the two main questions. I mean, there's not really much more to unpack beyond that. So I think as we go into this, you'll find that it's a very outdated concept or theory.
Yeah. And why was Thanos called Thanos? maybe we'll unpack that a little in here.
Yeah.
Not directly or intentionally, but it could happen because we talk about Marvel things sometimes.
We do. Yeah, it's going to come up for sure.
Okay, deal. But I said that this might have a little mythology. I'm realizing now that this will actually be pretty much entirely mythology, but not necessarily
not the way you think.
Not the way you think. All right, so we're talking about the death drive, the life drive, if you as well. There's two sides to every coin, and then there's like the outside of the coin as well. So maybe three sides.
Sure.
The first one we'll start with is Eros. This is the Greek god of love and sex. The Roman counterpoint, you may recognize as Cupid.
Yeah. And then we've also got Thanatos, which is the Greek god of death, who is also the first cousin once removed from Hades, the Greek god of the underworld.
It's complicated.
Yeah, it's those family trees are a little bit much, is all I'm saying.
Yeah.
Zeus had a lot of kids from a lot of different people. We're not going to unpack his stuff and all that today. But
he was Catholic.
Yes. And also very polyamorous. So Thanatos, his Roman counterpart is Mors or Ledum. There's two different versions of that. And so there's two different kind of stories around Thanatos as well.
Okay, now in psychology, these characters of Eros and Thanatos.
I'm going with Thanatos for this one.
Great. Eros and Thanatos, these characters play a central role in understanding this idea of a death drive, or another way to talk about the death drive is the human tendency and drive toward death and destruction that a lot of people point to as being inherent as part of human nature.
Right. So Eros being the life drive, being the idea that we have an instinct towards living, and then Thanatos being the death drive, being that we have an instinct towards moving towards death or being inorganic. And so we'll kind of unpack all of that in a little bit more as we go. So this drive, this idea of a death drive, is expressed through aggressive behavior, self-destructiveness, or repetitive compulsions that result in the deterioration of a person's well-being. So essentially, this person has a death drive that's so powerful they continue to engage in behavior until they are no longer alive.
Okay.
That's what this theory says.
All right. Or maybe the people around them are no longer alive.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
We stop doing most things when we're no longer alive.
Right. That's true. That's usually the end of the things we do.
That's usually the end. Now, this was originally proposed, this idea of sort of this Eros and Thanatos, the death drive, life drive sort of thing. This was proposed by Sabina, I'm going to say Spielrein.
That's as close as I got.
Yeah, German. Maybe I need to say a little bit angrier. Sabina Spielrein.
It's a little bit more in the throat. Like you got to get into the throat about it. Yeah.
Spielrein.
There you go.
Like that. Okay. In a paper titled, quote, "Destruction as the Cause of Coming into Being," end quote.
Yes. So in 1912, this was kind of a proposed discussion.
Okay.
From the psychology standpoint, we're going to get into the philosophy of this in a little bit. But a quick note on Sabina. She was a Russian physicist and considered one of the first female psychoanalysts. She followed the standard linear progression of patient to student to colleague of Carl Jung, who she later had a relationship with. And we had talked about already doing a whole episode on Sabina because I think that she's done a lot of really cool work and doesn't get the credit that she deserves. And you'll kind of see what happens in a second.
Yeah.
She also remained colleagues with Freud and practiced with Piaget. So she's done a lot of work in this world. She was quite accomplished, published 35 papers in 3 different languages, and was the first to publish on the topic of death drive or death instinct. So she was the very first person to actually publish on this. And she had a career of about 35 years or so.
Man.
And so, unfortunately, her life was cut short due to World War II and her death in the Holocaust. She was a Jewish practitioner. She was found and she was put to death in one of the camps. And we are going to do a whole episode on her. But she went from living in a psychiatric clinic to obtaining her doctorate and becoming the first woman to publish a psychoanalytic dissertation. That is a huge deal.
It's quite the life arc story.
Yes. Yeah, I'm saying.
All right, so in 1920, so this is 8 years later, Freud decided he would like a turn at discussing the concept of the death drive in his book, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, is what his book was called.
That sounds like a sci-fi book, doesn't it? Like it sounds like, it doesn't sound like a scientific text. It sounds like something that L. Ron Hubbard would write.
Well, it's not really a scientific text, but yes, it does sound like a sci-fi. Right. Type thing.
Yeah, it's anyway, I've never read it.
Some like erotica noir, maybe.
Yeah, probably. So many cigars in that book. So many cigars. Now, Freud expanded on the concept and described the death drive as an inherent tendency for organic things to return to an inorganic state of sorts. So this was part of a dualistic viewpoint that he kind of adopted, this idea that people also strove, or organisms strove towards life as well as death. And those two specific drives was the life drive, Eros, or Lebenstrieb, and the death drive, which was Todestrieb, is how I would imagine those are pronounced. My German is not very good, but that's how this kind of like this concept started.
I think you did at least as well as I did. I'm a little bit stuck on the idea of like these fat, girthy cigars, but I don't want to take away from our discussion here.
Sure.
Yes, essentially and we've talked about in previous episodes the idea. I think we've talked about this at least the whole idea of drives. I think we talked about this early on in an episode on motivation and how like there was this period in time in psychological history where everything was a drive. If you did it, there was a drive, and that was why you did it. Made it really like this podcast would have been so short back then. They're like, why do you pick your nose? You've got to pick your nose drive. We're done. Bye. See you next week.
Right.
Or maybe we would have just done like 25 episodes a week. I don't know. Anyway, as we're talking here, so the idea here, this life drive and death drive posits that organisms have these two inherent drives that influence their behavior. Again, by observing the fact that organisms behave.
Sure.
The life drive, or Eros, motivates the organism to behave in ways that are toward life-sustaining actions, right? And outcomes. So these are the things that are keeping them alive, eating, procreating, exercising, etc. The death drive, or thanatos, does the opposite. This is pushing the organism to move toward more destructive behaviors. Smoking cigars, giant, fat, girthy, thick, long cigars, war,
sure,
alcohol, sedentary, lots of those types of things.
These are essentially, when we say drives too, they're also described as instincts a lot when you look up the stuff on this. Yes. So like you'll hear the term instinct a lot, and we're going to unpack kind of what that means for clinical use as we go. And now Freud also argues that these drives operate in a kind of a general steady state, but will trend towards death, which he calls the nirvana principle. The nirvana principle is not bleach, it's not nevermind, and it's not in utero. Okay, that's a much better set of principles. Go listen to those instead.
It does smell like Teen Spirit, though.
It does smell like something, right? So the nirvana principle argues that these two drives essentially balance each other out and keep each other in check, but they still, the life drive has to work a little harder to get over on the death drive, because according to the APA, there's a quote about this. The death drive is, quote, the tendency of all instincts to remove tension and seek the stability and equilibrium of the inorganic state. That is death. This is the trend of the death instinct, which Sigmund Freud believed to be universal, end quote. So essentially, you've got these two drives. They're always kind of like teetering and balancing and trying to figure this stuff out. But ultimately, they're moving towards death, moving to less tension, moving to relief, essentially.
So the nirvana principle is that there is a happy balance between the two so that you can at least move forward without being pulled too heavily in one direction or the other, because being pulled toward life would definitely be too bad. And obviously the vacuousness of this theory, and we will continue to unpack, meaning there's this gaping hole in our understanding and our philosophy of this, like the gaping hole we're going to leave in this episode for ads. All right, we're back. I said gaping hole too many times, but it felt in keeping with our topic.
Right.
All right. We're talking about the nirvana principle, how this relates to the life drive, the death drive. Putting this simply, the idea here, every organism tends to work itself toward death due to these naturally occurring instincts, thanatos, and moving toward nirvana, the nirvana principle. The life drive helps balance the scales towards staying alive, keeping the organism living. So they're just stay nicely on that path of forward motion, I guess, because they're being pulled in two different directions, as evidenced by the fact that Freud said so.
Right. That was nice. That was good. Speaking of other things that Freud said, toward the end of his life, he actually changed what he thought about this theory. So he conceptualized this a bit differently. He began to classify instincts into two distinct categories. Sexual instincts, because of course he did. Why wouldn't he?
Freud? Wow.
Huh? I know. And then destructive instincts. So the sexual instincts ended up falling under Eros, and then those destructive instincts ended up falling under Thanatos. So Eros was less about life and more about sex, and Thanatos was more about destruction and not about death. So that's what he started conceptualizing towards the end of his life, rather than life and death.
How could it be any other way, really?
Right. People change, you know?
Yeah. Let's invite our old friend philosophy into this discussion and talk about what others have said about these ideas. So Schopenhauer had written about a philosophical death drive and metaphysical will in 1818. So this is like a century before all this took place. Well before Freud and his friends showed up on the scene. But isn't that the kind of crux of early psychology, right?
It all was discussed before in some way, just maybe in fluffier terms or something, right?
Yeah,
so
recycle, repackage, update the vernacular.
Yeah. So this guy Schopenhauer, not Schopenhauer, John Jingleheimer Schmidt, Schopenhauer. So he had written about the idea of will, or specifically he started calling it the will to live, which ultimately became Eros, right? The will to live was the instinct to live, the behaviors that we engage in to continue to live. And he wrote about that many, many moons ago, prior to this study here, before Sabina, really.
Yeah, I mean, he dove deep into the topic of this in his work, The World as Will and Representation. And this was back before there were a million books. I mean, you could pretty much read every book that had ever been written in your lifetime at this point. And then you'd be like, why did I spend all this time reading that? But anyway, he believed that life in general produced more suffering than happiness. So he was a Christian. So the only reason that humans persisted was due to the drive toward life and pleasure, I guess. And so, yeah, that was sort of his thesis there.
Yeah. So essentially what he kind of landed on was that behavior continues because of reward. Strange.
Don't make me agree with him.
That's kind of what he landed on, though. So Freud even quotes Schopenhauer in his writings about Thanatos. In the same writing, he claims to have discovered the theme of death. Freud did. Freud claimed to have stumbled upon the idea of death, by the way.
That's impressive.
Like, he literally, he's writing about it, and I was reading, I was like, there's no way that he thinks this. Maybe this is out of context. And no, he was like, I stumbled upon this theme of death, this idea of death and what it meant. And I was like, no, you didn't, dude. Like, you are, like, so many people did this. Like, any philosopher talked about this at some point.
What a pioneer.
Any religion talked about this. I know. He just was so full of himself.
In the 1920s. Guess what, guys? I figured out that people die.
People die. It's a thing.
Like, I thought all this time that we'd been fighting wars, we were just putting them to sleep for a very long time.
We'll talk about sleep too.
Sure.
In a little bit. But yes.
How could we not?
It is really astounding to me that they had the gall to be like, yeah, I figured this out. I figured out what death means. Only later to change it.
Yeah, we'll probably get some criticisms from people who say that wasn't what he was actually saying. It's fine. Whatever.
That's fine.
Write in. Tell us.
Let us know. We want to hear.
It's great. Yeah. Okay, so we're talking about the philosophy. We've unpacked, I think, more or less what this drive is trying to say here. How is this useful? What does this do for us in psychology that allows us to be effective clinicians, effective scientists, philosophers, what have you? The idea here is that psychoanalysts could identify that there was a cause, heavy scare quotes there, for certain destructive behaviors that naturally occur in humans. They're just gonna do it. They just gots to do it. Oh, you're aggressive, self-harming. That is your genetic tendency toward death, the death drive. We all have it. Let's work how to counterbalance it. It is essentially just stop appreciating death more and appreciate life more. You know, Bob Newhart sort of said this in his comedic the bit on like Mad TV. I think it was what it was on, when someone came in with a problem and he said he like, this is how much it's going to cost. We're going to do this thing, and then he says, "Stop it." She was like, "What?" He's like, "Yeah, stop it." She's like, "I don't understand." He's like, "You said you do all these things, right?" She's like, "Yeah." And he said, "Stop it."
It's so great, and that's honestly kind of what's going on here.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's what they landed on. Is they're like, well, just stop having a death drive. Just don't do it anymore.
Don't do that. Yeah. So I guess maybe if it wasn't clear as we've been talking about this, the idea of a death drive as an instinct is an intrinsic motivation situation here, right? So this is happening as like every human has it no matter what. And we are, no matter the circumstances, no matter the person, we have an inherent or innate drive towards these types of behaviors. So I think it's worth expanding on this a little bit. And like, I want you to kind of walk through this with me as if for listeners out there, let's talk about this. So if all behavior follows a motivation, then understanding inherent motivations would be helpful, right? So if we can go back and say, we understand that behavior is motivated. So if we understand what the motivation is, then we can better serve the behavior or change the behavior or alter the behavior. That makes sense, right?
Might even start a podcast about it and call it Why We Do What We Do.
Yeah, we might end up on a radio show that we have created on our own with no filters and no guidelines. But if we know that humans tend to trend toward death and destruction, then we can create countermeasures and interventions that tip the scales back towards love and the will to live and all that, right? That makes sense when you say it like that a little bit. Yeah. Logical sense, maybe.
The humans triumphing over nature. If the death drive is an inherent part of us because we intrinsically understand what death is, regardless of language, just in there, then we can triumph over it by the power of psychoanalysis and Freud and his contemporaries. Right.
That's essentially what they're landing on. So kind of going forward, if this is an inherent instinct, which an instinct is defined as, quote, an innate, typically fixed pattern of behavior in animals in response to certain stimuli. So that's what an instinct is. If this is an inherent instinct, then we have to understand that this will never go away if it's part of our genetic code, right? We cannot therapize our instincts away. So rather, any intervention would, quote, keep it in check, if you will, but it wouldn't eliminate it. It's the equivalent as of saying like, oh, you want to eat? We're going to therapize your eating away so that you don't eat ever and you won't need to eat because eating in itself and hunger is an innate thing, right?
Some people would love that.
Yeah, I know. Some people would absolutely love that. So the death drive is on that same level of instinct and genetic requirement and innate motivation, right? It can never be therapized away.
All right. So simply put, the death instinct never leaves. It can never be cured. It's just a part of the human experience. You've got it. You got it in you.
Right.
You get it, got it good. This is the same as our survival, reproductive, and social instincts, among others. We have so many. The Thanatos and Eros are here to stay. They're just in there, just doing their thing. Never mind that they might contradict other instincts or other instincts contradict them. They're there, just being there, just doing their thing.
Right. So speaking of contradictions, let's talk for a second about the survival instinct. So we have an instinct towards death, but we also have a survival instinct, which is toward life.
Right. Yeah.
So, which is different than Eros, right? So if we're in danger, we're likely to engage in behavior to reduce that danger or seek our safety. But if we are in a safe place, we are also less likely to engage in safety-seeking behaviors because we don't need to. But if we have a death drive that's in place, then it wouldn't matter that we were safe and it wouldn't matter that we had a survival instinct because the death instinct would probably override that in a lot of cases, right?
Sure.
I mean, by the logic that we've discussed so far.
Yeah. No, exactly. Also, the existence of a survival instinct, again, it sort of negates the death instinct at some level. Arguably, I mean, we want to survive, but we don't. And we also want to have sex in between. I mean, actually, that sounds more like a Monday for me. But the idea here is sort of like baseline is we are trying to survive. And superimposed on top of that is we want to die or cause destruction or both. So that's also kind of part of baseline, but we can overcome it with more of that. The implications here seem confusing, to put it mildly.
Right. That's kind of where I kind of land is like, it doesn't necessarily on the surface make sense. So if we really kind of get into it though, like in all seriousness, all of these types of generalized kind of innate motivations lack a few things. Those few things that it lacks are context, right? And then ultimately that's kind of what I landed on as I was going through this. It was like, okay, so context really paints a picture for how motivations start to kind of speak up or like act in a situation, right? Like motivations are created based on context, as I would say.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it is the exact problem of calling everything a drive or an instinct. Without context, one would assume that these instincts would be at war within ourselves, constantly battling for the control over our behavior and decisions. At any given time, the wolf of death instinct would override the wolf of our other survival instinct. But these are separate wolves, never overlapping. They are the two wolves inside of me, and they are indecisive. There was actually, I just recently learned about this. I think it's called a podcast. It's called The One You Feed, that has to do with this idea of like which thing you feed inside of you, which desire,
Sure.
which drive. There's actually some kind of utility to that way of thinking about it, I think. But anyway, this is the similar idea here, right? And I guess they might even point to this conflict and say, this is why we have suffering. This is why we have depression. This is why we have politics and all the other bad things that humans do.
Sure.
is because we have these death drives and life drives warring inside us, and we just don't ever know what to do at any point. So we're just kind of fumbling along doing the things that we do, and that's the reason, is because the raging internal war.
I do appreciate the idea that our death drive is the cause of politics, right? Like, so it is like the manifestation of our death drive, where we say, you know what, we all really want to die. So like, let's go ahead and start a political system full of rich white people that can't make any decisions for anybody but themselves. Like, and then argue about things that really don't matter. Like, this is really good. American politics are the manifestation of the death drive.
I was thinking the other day how much fun it would be to unpack how kings ever came to be. Like, how did monarchies get started?
Sure.
Because I'm like, at some point, like, that got really off the rails really quickly. And I'm curious, at what point someone was like, you know, we should have that one person have all the privilege, just all of it. They should have all of it. And like, no questions asked. That's just it from now on. And everyone's like, yeah, okay.
I don't know if you play a lot of games on your phone, but like I play these games where like Royal Match or whatever comes up a lot, and it's like always a king that's like stuck in a trap. That's like your whole goal is to save the king, and I was like, they don't know their audience. Like, there's not a chance I'm going to save a king. Like we don't need kings. Like, no gods, no emperors, nothing like that. But but they're going to go ahead and market a game that they want me to save a white king. No thanks, I'm not doing it. So I think ultimately what we land on here is, without context, our instincts don't kick in, right? So like,
good point.
Without something acting upon us, our instincts never kick in. I don't start engaging in survival instincts if there's nothing to survive from.
Right.
Right? Like, oh, maybe I put on a beanie today. Like, I put on a hat. So like, I'm cold. So maybe that was a survival instinct thing. I don't know. Anyway, if we're safe, we're not likely to engage in our survival instincts. So instinct is not behavior. We can recognize that. So even if the instinct is there, the behavior is not guaranteed to occur. Even if the death instinct is there, if we want to assume that it's a real thing and that it's there, it doesn't necessarily guarantee that we're going to engage in destructive behavior or self-harm behavior or anything like that. And I think that's also an important kind of line to draw when it comes to this theory.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense until the circumstances are there that you'd have the opportunity to do something, and then you try and point to the thing that you've done and say, oh, it is because of this instinct. But, gently insert and slip in ads here. All right, let's not that we haven't been snarky this whole time, and if if those ads really threw you off and you're like, wait, what were you talking about again? Who knows? I mean, we've largely been talking about the Thanatos and Eros thing, this idea of survival and instinct. Let's actually like I said, we've been snarky, but let's really tear it apart now.
First of all, in the science itself, Blanco in 2005 discusses a few holes in the theory, and I think that these are worth noting.
Sure.
First, Freud's work is largely based on concepts like the unconscious. However, since death is an unknown quantity to humans, i.e. we have never knowingly experienced death. I mean, unless we want to talk reincarnation and stuff like that, that's a different conversation.
Or like the people who like die for like a few minutes and then are brought back, probably.
Yeah, that's probably the closest. But for the most part, when it comes to the unconscious specifically, it's an unknown quantity. We haven't experienced it. Then the unconscious can't actually drive behavior towards something that it's never experienced or away from it because it's never experienced it. So that's kind of a thing that's one of the discussions in the article. The second thing, the unconscious does not recognize time and space. So because it doesn't recognize time and space, and because it doesn't operate in time and space because it's not real, such parameters around instinct are absent. So for an instinct to arise in a place where time and space doesn't exist, it doesn't make any sense from like a theoretical standpoint. So those two things, besides there's multiple arguments in this article that talk about why they can't coexist. I thought that was kind of an interesting way to look at it. It's like unconscious in itself, besides not existing, doesn't exist in a place where time and space does exist. And because of that, instincts cannot exist in that space.
That's fair. It's almost in a way entertaining Freud beyond what is necessary to like, but I mean, unpacking, point for point, I think is relevant. So
sure.
Koratar in 2022 attempts to explain terrorist tendencies related to being the unwelcome child. The argument is such: the unwelcome child has low eros instinct, life drive, and greater thanatos instinct, the death drive, leading to less self-preservation instincts and a greater penchant for destructive behavior.
Right. I think our point is getting really clear here. The ultimate argument here is whether there is an intrinsic motivation toward more destructive behavior. This doesn't align with any behavioral discussions that we've had on the show already. And from a parsimonious perspective, is it really more likely that someone engages in aggressive or self-destructive behavior because of some immediate reward, either biological in the form of some feedback or input, or social in the form of some environmental context or some delivery system? Or is it an innate process that no matter what we do, we will never get better? I feel like the environment still kind of rules over the scenario.
Well, yeah. I mean, the death drive, just like any other instinct, repeatedly and continuously falls flat in the face of context, circumstance, and the conditions we've described under which behavior tends to occur. As Shane was typing these notes, he was sitting in his office having a delicious cup of coffee, listening to feel-good music of the 70s and 80s bops, a playlist that we'll include in the links here.
Yes.
There's not a single part of Shane that wanted to walk into the void, drive off a cliff. I mean, there aren't really options for that in Florida, but or engage in any sort of behavior that was violent or destructive.
So in that context, my needs were all met, and met quite well, as a matter of fact. I brewed my own coffee, and it was delicious, and life is good. And maybe that's the nature of instinct. But in the event that I felt some urge or motivation to engage in all that behavior, all it takes is a change of context, and I'm free of it, right? So like if I'm starting to feel real bad about something, all I gotta do is just turn the heat on so I'm not cold. Look, I'm good. All right. So does that speak to innate nature or just by circumstances? And I think it's very clear that it lands on circumstances.
Really quickly, we'll just revisit this discussion of like the tendency to call something innate, to call it a drive, to call it an instinct. If you drink to excess, you have an alcoholic drive or instinct. You play video games, you have a video game drive or instinct. You are literally just saying this is a behavior that you're doing plus the word instinct, right?
Right.
It doesn't at all explain how that behavior came to be or why it's there. And it also presumes like instinct, this implicit drive, it presumes again that this is part of the natural human experience. They've actually said as much. That has been explicitly stated. It's not even a intrinsic detail. It is an explicitly stated feature of the condition of the idea of instinct and drive, etc. And if that's the case, that presumes that our genes that we've evolved over hundreds of thousands of years have presumably were like, at some point, I'm going to know what a beanie is. So I am going to program for when cold, find beanie. That is the drive.
Right.
And I think you could, that's being a little bit snarky. You could make the argument that it was when cold, find warmth. And that beanie just happens to be a thing that you've learned represents warmth. But again, all you're doing is you're painting the thing that you've done into the circumstance that has arrived. And even find warmth, I think, is not as parsimonious as we could be. That is like when cold, escape cold is, I think, the more conservative way of describing it, which could be anything. This is crawl into a hole, bury yourselves with leaves, find fire, put on a coat, run.
Build a nice house.
Yeah, nice house. Do anything that increases your body temperature in some capacity. Lay naked with a bunch of people. That could be a thing that happens.
It does.
And like all of those things. So like
happens to all of us.
What the solution is and like how it's arrived at, and then there are those who are like, for whatever reason, that thing doesn't happen. Well, not to get into it too much, but like as you get very cold and your body starts to shut down, and warmth or lack of cold no longer seems like very motivating. Arguing that is a death drive makes a lot less sense than saying, actually what happens is that our blood, like our body is starting to shut down, and like our brain is no longer really sensitive to those kinds of things. It's just sort of like, turn off power to stations. We're going to sleep now.
Sure.
Indefinitely, but permanently. Like can't handle this anymore. Can't survive the situation.
one thing that I keep kind of going back to is like, okay, so these theories and this discussion was 100 years ago, right? So this was also a period of time where, you know, they didn't know, there's no way to know as much as we do now. And that's fine, because in 100 years from now, we're going to sound like we had no idea what we're talking about, which we might sound like already, but we're definitely going to sound like it in 100 years. You know, things that we understand about psychology today, you know, things like self-harming behavior, destructive behavior, compulsions, all of those things are better explained through what we understand of the current science that came out decades after these discussions. So we're talking, you know, we understand more about brain anatomy. We understand more about biology and neurology and how there's those interplays. We understand more about psychotropic medication. We understand more about mental health diagnoses. To some degree, we understand at least a little bit more than what they understood back then.
A lot more about genetics too.
Yeah, a lot more about genetics. And so I think when we kind of unpack this, we have to also, I think the most charitable I can be is that you had a group of people that didn't know better. They knew what they knew at the time, and they just didn't know any better, right? That's as far as I can go. At the time, too, I mean, when we're talking about the stuff that was coming up, there were other scientists that were doing a better job of being scientists at the time. So while you had a group of people that didn't know what was going on, you had another group of people who were actually studying science and other people who were just talking out of their asses about death drives and stuff like that.
If I wanted to be unnecessarily charitable to the idea of this one, I think the point that I would make is that arguably there is only life drive, even when we do destructive things. If you imagine things like wars and battles, those are often motivated by a desire to protect your resources, eliminate a threat, secure your region or your people or your boundary, whatever that might be. If you think about things even that are like self-destructive that people engage in, they often are also associated with hedonistic pleasures of things that we enjoy, things that feel good. Or even when we know that they're self-destructive and they don't even feel good, oftentimes it is the like, I'm in such pain, I seek some other outlet to eliminate the pain. So the drive is escape aversiveness in these situations. So I think if I were to charitably point to any part of this, it's that there is a huge amount of reward built into our instinctual God, I hate even saying this because it's so dumb. But let's just pretend, for example, that we have all of these instinctual behaviors. But if those exist, they are to preserve us exclusively. Like even the things that we do that look destructive, self-destructive, and harmful, you can usually and I think always tie back to some tendency of escaping aversive things that are associated with more harm. And sometimes that is even self-destruction to the point of death.
Right.
I was like, I'm in such pain. The only escape from this pain is death. I'm in such, like, this is such an aversive situation. The only escape is to cause an enormous amount of destruction, which may even risk my own well-being.
Right.
Like you could maybe wrap it up in that. So this idea that we have a drive toward death and destruction really doesn't make any sense. Even though I'm trying to be charitable. As you said, I think the nicest thing that you can be is like, poor stupid children, you really did not know very much back then, and you were just trying. You like, we know that science is around, but we don't really understand how it applies to what we're trying to do, and we're really not going to bother trying to find out how it applies to what we're doing. So instead, we're just going to speculate wildly and write books about it. And boy, did they.
You know, and that's where I feel like the army of psychoanalysts are going to come at us, is like, you know, because we are, for the same reason when people kind of like go into some of the works that we believe are like seminal works. Like I understand that, like, in defense of your field, like I understand that want and that need. But at the end of the day, this particular thing just doesn't make sense for what we understand about behavior today. And arguably, this particular thing that we're talking about didn't make sense for what we understood about behavior back then.
Yeah,
like I think that's the thing that I want to kind of go back to, is like back then we had enough information about how behavior worked, at least enough to understand how this didn't make as much sense as what we understand today.
Yeah. And that's exactly, I was going to sort of add that piece, is that this wasn't even a good contemporary analysis. Arguably at the time that the first book was being written in 1818, like then I'm like, yeah, the science of psychology practically didn't exist at that point.
Right.
It was at best there was some philosophers who had decided that they could also apply their general ideas to things like talking about human behavior. And you had some versions of it, like the book that guy wrote in the early 1800s.
Yeah, Jingleheimer Schmidt.
Yeah, in the 1920s, like at this point, we already had Watson, we already had Skinner, we already had Pavlov, we already had William James. We had people who had been speculating, writing, researching, and talking about this for decades. So, I mean, there really wasn't an excuse for that to make a lot of sense other than this renaissance of what I would call whimsical musings about psychology. And we talked about Freud. He was an interesting character. He actually was not so devoid of contributions that like everything he did was completely asinine.
Sure.
He had some things that he did that actually were helpful for the field of psychology for sure. But we just talk about, you know, ideas like this and his contemporaries and the things they wrote about. And it's just sort of like, no.
Well, I liken it to this. Like, I think you're right. Like, I think that, like, you know, when you talk about figures like this, I think that it is important to understand that, like, people are complicated and there are lots of things to unpack within that space. Like, yes, there are things that he contributed, and he contributed to a field that continued to advance and continue to grow. And there is some of that influence there. We can't ignore the influence. But your favorite band has a song that you don't listen to, and that's okay. Like, that's kind of what this is. This is the B-side that didn't make the cut because you don't like it, right? This is the thing that was left on the cutting room floor in the studio because it wasn't good enough to make the album. Like, that's what this is. And I think it's important to understand that, like, whatever you want to say about the rest of his work, we're not talking about the rest of his work. We're talking about this particular thing, which wasn't good enough to stand the test of time.
I almost like the title, the B-side that didn't make the cut as the title for this episode. But then I think people would think that we were talking about this episode as like a B-side episode. And I do not. I think this is a side A episode, not like side B ads. We managed to stretch this one out a lot. I'm impressed. We do have some interesting tidbits and take homes, and then we'll wrap this up for today, I think.
Yeah, I think that sounds good. So one of the things that I think is important to know, too, is like after all of this stuff was developed, Freud had a lot of students that worked with him. And some of his students tried to further classify those instincts, developing terms like mortido, which is the energy withdrawal related to libido, destrudo, which was the death instinct that they went on, and ego libido, which is really fun to say.
That is fun to say.
There are a lot of terms that they kind of tried to coin and come up with and continue to research, but none of them really stuck.
Eros has a magical bow and arrow that helps people fall in love. Interesting idea that might be worth unpacking at some point. The idea that you shoot someone with an arrow to make them fall in love. Yeah. Different implication for a world in which guns exist.
Sure.
But even back then, I don't think an arrow was traditionally known for its nurturing capabilities.
Not for its kindness.
Yeah, for its kindness, yeah. Swords and hearts. Mm-hmm. So anyway, Eros eventually married a mortal woman named Princess Psyche, and hence psychology was born.
Yes, I guess a modern version of the bow and arrow would be Love Gun, which is the Kiss song, which I think is a reference to a penis.
Okay, wow.
I would imagine. Knowing Kiss, it's definitely a reference to a penis.
How did the words love gun, kiss, and penis make it into an episode about Freud?
I don't think it was that far of a stretch. I think that was like a 1 degree removed if we're talking about Freud and sex. So
yeah, almost a guarantee actually.
Freud to Kiss, guaranteed. I mean, when you have songs like Lick It Up, yeah, it's right there. Yeah. It's low hanging fruit. But pretty impressed that we got the kiss somehow.
It's a low-hanging, swinging fruit.
Now, Thanatos was not born of the gods. Rather, he was a piece of Nyx's spirit to come to life, or, depending on what you have read, he was born of the gods. He was a son of Nyx and Erebos, so 2 other Greek gods in here. Now, Thanatos was the god who brought peaceful deaths. Like, he was the god of death who brought peaceful deaths. He was known to have a soft touch, and he's often characterized by holding an upside-down torch in a butterfly or a wreath. The butterfly or wreath signified the souls of the dead that he would carry with him to the underworld, to his cousin Hades. Now, Thanatos was also a twin. His twin, Hypnos, was the god of sleep, and this is where the saying "death and his brother sleep" was originated from.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah.
Let's hit some take-home points here. I think, Freud took a few ideas from women who were likely smarter than he was and deserved more recognition than he did. Specifically, we're talking about Sabina here, who actually wrote this down first. Wasn't actually the first, like someone preceded Sabina, even though, as we've seen, but at least in the contemporaries of Freud, Sabina should have gotten the credit for this. But it is how things go. So that's what happened with Freud.
I think the other thing, too, is that there is no true utility in understanding what this thing is, if this thing even existed. I think there are better ways to explain behavior, and I think there are better ways to explain, I guess, the overall kind of like how general motivation works beyond just believing that every single person the day they are born has a drive towards death.
Yeah, if you're writing a college essay and you have to summarize this, hopefully you have enough fodder here to at least do a pretty decent job at
Sure.
getting started. But I also think you can just criticize the shit out of it for being a useless turd of a theory. It's a hypothesis, barely hypothesis, a speculative musing of a person who was on a little bit too much cocaine at the time.
Sure.
Again, it falls into the trap of trying to explain everything by calling it an instinct when you observe a behavior to happen at all. Like that happened because it's an instinct. That is essentially the sort of thesis that I would at least land on in terms of why it's problematic, is that it is descriptive without context. It is not prescriptive. It is not helpful, and it is not parsimonious, conceptually, philosophically, or clinically.
I think you nailed it. I think that would have been my final take-home point. I think that you said exactly what I was going to say in exactly the same words, and I couldn't say it better myself.
I nailed that coffin door shut. One more myth in the ground.
Busted.
All right. Well, if you're joining us for the first time, thank you so much for being here. We hope that this was useful for you and your trivia nights, or just your general thought-provoking weekend, weekly ideas. It's, people call it hump day, I guess, if this comes out on Wednesday. So if you're listening to it then, something that if you're joining us for the first time, you may not know is that we just recommend some things. It's fun. We start by talking about holidays.
Yeah.
At the top of our episodes, we end by talking about fun things. And in the middle, we do a lot of ranting and yelling and stream of consciousness type delivery of
Yes,
content.
we do.
But before we get to some recommendations, it is important to acknowledge the things that help keep us doing this show, which is that if you would like to support us, you can like and subscribe, leave a rating and review, tell a friend about us, go to our website, pick up some merch, or join us on Patreon. When you do join us on Patreon, and I say when, not if, but when you do, you get all kinds of perks, benefits, and other great joys that help us, help you. It just makes the world a little bit brighter of a place, because we know there's a crew of people who are dedicated to learning and science and parsimony and skepticism, and they're just good. And that group of people also has the benefit of me reading their names to you, to your ears, to hear them in recognition of their great contributions and how much we appreciate them. And that includes Mike M, Megan, Layla, Mike T, Justin, Kim, Joshua, Brad, Stephanie, Olivia, Brian, and Ashley. Thank you all again and again and forever.
Yes, you all are the greatest. Lots of arrows to you.
Yes, so much arrows. Not being shot with arrows, but arrows, In addition, I could not do this without the help of my awesome, excellent team of wonderful people writing and fact-checking from Shane and myself. With special credit, Shane put this whole thing together today, so thank you for your work on this one, dude.
Anytime. It was so great.
Of course, audio engineering and editing comes from Justin. Our social media coordinator is Emma Wilson. Is there anything you would like to add, or anything that I forgot before we get to our recommendations?
No, I think that covers it.
Okay, arrows away. Recommendation time.
Recommendations.
I'm going to recommend really quick a movie that I saw recently. For those of you who are into superhero type films, this one was so much better than I thought it was going to be. So maybe I shouldn't even recommendation and tell you to go into it with very low expectations, because that's what I did, and it worked out for me. So I don't want to overhype this, but I was expecting just nothing from this movie, and it was better than I thought. This was The Flash. This is the 2023 movie about the character in the DC universe called The Flash, who he just moves very quickly. And I think a quick synopsis of this movie is sort of a time travel thing, is a way to put this.
Yeah.
Like I said, without getting into spoilers, without unpacking it too much, it had a lot more heart and a lot more guts than I expected it to have. And it's not a perfect movie. It's not the best movie you'll ever see, but it was good. Like I enjoyed it, at least. I thought it was better. Again, I thought it was better than I expected it to be. And I appreciated what they did with the film. So I think particularly if you're up on your DC Comics lore, you'll probably enjoy features of it more. Mostly the movies. If you've seen a lot of the movies, I mean, the more lore you have, they shoehorn in a lot of Easter eggs.
They do.
I mean, I think if you've at least seen like a bunch of the Batman movies and a bunch of the Superman movies, and you have a pretty good understanding of like what happened in the DC universe, generally speaking, the DCEU, the movie universe, then you'll probably appreciate this. If you're familiar with the comics, you'll appreciate this, I think, or at least parts of this. So yeah, that's what I have to say about The Flash. That's my recommendation.
Yeah, it's kind of like butterfly effects without Ashton Kutcher.
Yeah, and a lot more CGI. Just so much more.
A lot more CGI, yes. It's a worthy watch, I would say. I agree with that. All right, so I'm recommending a band. This album came out in 2003, so it's over 20 years old now, it hurts me to say that. But if you are familiar with this very specific period of time where post-hardcore, indie, emo, all that stuff was like really popular, and a lot of bands had a lot of really long song titles and really long album titles, then you will relate to this and you will love it so much. So this band is called Bear vs. Shark, and the album is called Right Now You're in the Best of Hands, and if something isn't quite right, your doctor will know in a hurry.
Wow. I bet that whole line appears in the song several times.
Somewhere. They do have a song called We Were Sad, But Now We're Rebuilding on this album, which is really cool. So this band is really interesting. I think they're really catchy. I think they are really unique. I think the singer's voice is really unique. I think some of his lyrics are really fun. I think that they are like a more optimistic and happy Me Without You. Like, I think that they are just like a more poppy version, like where the guy's lyrics are like a little bit off. His vocals are kind of really strange. Like, he doesn't sound like anybody else. And they're just I think this is just a really good example of kind of that time where people were being really creative and really interesting with the genre and not just a bunch of starting lines. Yeah, I really, really love this album. And I think it's worth giving it a listen.
Okay, fair enough.
I think it holds up really well.
Was Me Without You the one where the guy just talked the whole time?
Yes, okay. that is the band. Uh-huh.
Okay. So the modern B-52s, basically.
Yeah, but without any spunk, you know?
Yeah, there you go.
It's like a poet's B-52s.
Sure. I don't know if I've ever listened to this album, but I'm curious. You piqued my interest here. So
I actually think that you would really like it. I think that because it's so interesting, I think that, and I know what kind of music you like, I think that you would actually really dig this one.
Okay, fair enough. All right. Well, if you'd like to tell us about Bear vs. Shark or The Flash or anything related to psychoanalysis that we got wrong or we got right, or you just like to compliment us on our hair, assuming that you saw our hair somehow, that would be impressive. But if you'd like to do any of those things, you should reach out to us directly. You can email us at info@wwd.podcast.com if you're old like us, or you can reach out to us on social media platforms. We're on most of them, the regular ones anyway, and you can find us there. We're not on the ones that are currently circling the drain of a toilet, but we're on the normal social media platforms. And we do have someone will talk to you if you try and talk to us. Someone on the team, at least. Anyway, we look forward to hearing from you. So please reach out to us and do that thing. I think that is all that I have to add here. Is there anything else to add before we wrap up?
I got nothing else.
Okay, thank you all for listening. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We are out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.